All right, so today is May 25th, 2026. It's Memorial Day, and I'm interviewing Angelo Lopez, a cartoonist, and I'm going to allow Angelo to give a quick introduction, and then I'll go into some questions for this project called Spaces of Belonging. And just really briefly, the Spaces of Belonging project has been, I think it's the third year, and we've been collecting interviews from mostly people from the Japantown, San Jose Japantown community, but it's been more expanded to folks that live in Santa Clara County. And it's part of the California History Center's archive, and it speaks to history, but also about the social forces of change that are happening. And so some of the questions will address, like, some of the larger social forces that have shaped the communities of Santa Clara Valley. Um, so I will start with asking Angelo to share a little bit about himself. So if you can share your birth date and your occupation and your ethnicity.
Okay. So my name is Angelo Lopez. I'm a Filipino American. I was born in 1967. I worked most of my life in a public library, the Santa Clara Public Library and then the Sunnyvale Public Library. But on the side, I would do editorial cartoons for a community newspaper called the Philippine News Today. That paper was based in Daly City in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was in that paper for, I think, from 2011 to 2023. So I think was that 12 years? 12 years? Do I have that math right? Yeah. So around 12 years or so. And during the time in the paper, I tried to learn more about the Filipino American community and what's going on in the Philippines.
Oh, great. But that's perfect for an introduction. And so my first question is, would you be willing to tell us a little bit about your family background?
Okay. Well, my parents are immigrants from the Philippines, from Naik, Cavite. My dad went in the Navy in the early 50s, and I was sort of at that time there was a sort of program where Filipinos could go into the American Navy, and so my dad was in the Navy. I think from 1959 to 1979 and stuff. And that's during that time he went around the world and stuff. And he met my mom, and they eventually settled in the United States in I think 1965. But before then, my dad was in the United States in the South and stuff. So me and my siblings spent most of our early years going from one military base to another. And so we lived in a very multiracial uh, um, community of military families and stuff. And I basically had a nice childhood and stuff. It was very nice, but it was tough because every 2 or 3 years we would have to move. So I would develop friendships, and then we would move, and I would really miss those friendships and stuff. So it was a generally happy childhood, but I had my moments of anxiety whenever we would have to move. So unlike some people, I know friends who've had childhood friends from when first grade. That's not been my experience. So, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Oh, Steve, I think your mic is
Oh, sorry, I'm muted. Sorry. Sorry. So my question was, in terms of that feeling of belonging, that you might have felt during certain moments, could you talk about the certain moments that pop up when you think about your young childhood, like grade, kindergarten to fifth grade? Like, were there certain spaces that you felt that stick out to you as having like strong memories of like belonging?
Yes. Well, my second, third, and fourth grades, I really had fond memories of.
Hmm.
I don't really remember my kindergarten, but my first grade was in Japan. But I was kind of bullied as a kid, so I don't remember that very well. I think I was blocking out some memories and stuff. But second, third, and fourth grade, I felt a deep sense of belonging both in my class. Everybody got along pretty well with each other, and I developed some close friendships. So when I had to move, the third and fourth, I four-doored in 1976 to Moffett Field. And I really missed my third grade friends, but I actually developed wonderful fourth grade friends. And I think part of it was that I really liked my teachers, the teachers that I had at that time, Mr. McGinnis and my second and third grade teachers, Miss Lathrop, I think, and I forgot the other teacher's name, but those they were wonderful teachers and stuff. And because it was a military family, it tended to be close knit because um, we lived in an area where everybody knew where everybody was. There wasn't that sort of enlisted people don't get paid. We get pretty much paid the this. We were in the same socioeconomic level and stuff. So, and I don't remember. I could stay up until late, and my parents wouldn't worry about me. And the same was true of the kids in the neighborhood. There wasn't that same sense of worrying about people's safety as there is now. Kids. So I felt safe. I felt safe, and the bonds, the friendships that I developed, I really had fond memories of, and it was just a nice time. I'd run home and I'd watch Batman reruns or the Monkeys, and it was a nice time and stuff. We in Fort Ord, there was a when I there was a lot of playgrounds you could play at and stuff, and in Moffett, we would have these little courts, and all the kids in the court would get to know each other, and we would play. We would sometimes play baseball together, or not so much football, mostly baseball. And in the '70s, baseball was America's game and stuff. So, so we knew all the. I don't think America's as passionate about baseball as it was in the '70s and stuff. I could be wrong and stuff, but yeah,
Yeah, those things change over time, right? Like in terms of what's the sort of epicenter of culture or the center of culture.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, when I'm speaking to other interviewees, like they talk about, those changing trends and what's popular. But
yeah,
what I noticed too about the more recent cultural, I guess, subcultures and cultures around youth culture is that
yeah.
they tend to be centered around trading t-shirts and clothing and dance moves and things like that.
Oh,
So that's a way in which you kind of have that sense of like the material change of capitalism.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, pop culture in my time was important. I think everybody, when Roots came along, um, you know, uh, everybody in the class would talk about it. We all watched it. Or in sports, if Muhammad Ali was in a fight, the next day, everybody in the bus would be talking about the fight and stuff.
mhm.
There were certain culture, either sports or television or movies we would all talk about and stuff. So like I knew I this is later than my fourth grade, but I remember in sixth, seventh grade, I knew friends who watched Star Wars like 50 or 60 times. So there were certain pop culture moments that kind of bound us together and stuff, that we had a point of commonality and stuff. So
Mhm.
Michael Jackson and the Motown 25 reunion. The next day after that, everybody talked about it and stuff. So there were certain cultural milestones that we all shared.
Yeah, yeah. I was just actually talking to my students in winter quarter about the Michael Jackson moonwalk moment, and I
Yeah,
guess it was that 25th anniversary, right?
yeah,
Yeah, and I was talking about it as a kind of almost like a almost like a kind of discursive shift or a cultural moment, right? That was like a signal of something changed. I'm not sure how to articulate what it was, but it was almost like a breaking through of racial and sort of cultural
yeah.
spaces coming together, like converging or integrating into the symbol of Michael Jackson. I don't know how you feel about that.
I kind of saw it and stuff because Well, the Michael Jackson Motown 25, that was high school,
Hmm.
not grade school.
Right.
I remember like, in high school, at least when I remember, for whatever I don't remember why, but musical tastes were segregated. People who liked heavy metal tended not to hang around people who liked soul or rap and stuff.
Hmm.
You know, the people who like country didn't hang out. There was a sort of musical segregation that led to people who loved the music having they were their own cliques. But Michael
Hmm.
Jackson, because Van Halen, I think he was the one who did the guitar lead
Yes, he
in
did.
Beat It, right? And
Yeah.
so a lot of the heavy metal kids who would usually not listen to kind of more soul music love Beat It just because they wanted to hear the solo, right? I think Michael Jackson, I think he was musically trained to cross musical genres and stuff. He was happy to do that because a lot of his musical forebears, I guess, did the same thing and stuff. He was sort of a cultural mix and stuff. Some of the other stars of that, like Prince, was great, but it was only later with Purple Rain that he broke into the mainstream. And it was the same thing with him. He was such a great guitar player. All of the heavy metal guy, rock and roll people respected him because he would, and Let's Go Crazy, he had that great guitar solo and stuff. And so they respected him because the guy could play and stuff. And that broke some barriers too. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I feel like that theme around communities integrating is important, to this topic of communities of belonging
yeah,
and I don't want to leave out this important aspect in the interview because I think that popular culture does have a role in social change, and for me, it kind of pivots around the issue of commercialization, the level of commercialization, and the way in which people consume that popular culture matters.
yeah,
For example, the difference between 1980s watching a movie together, like say you went to see E.T. and you're with a community watching it, then you go to school and you're talking to your friends about it, right?
yeah,
Um, so that is a particular way of consumption. Whereas if you fast forward to today, some people will watch a movie at the theater, some will watch it at home, some will
yeah,
watch it on their phone, and it's not the same sort of shared experience.
yeah,
Um, and there's something qualitatively different about that and the way it directs us, consciously and how we feel a sense of community or not, right? And so it really does matter in terms of spaces and how we belong to a space
yeah,
and the role of commercialization as a social force.
yeah.
I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, I think when I watched the movie in the 80s and 70s, if it was a popular movie, it was packed.
Hmm.
You know, I just remember it. And if I would mention like something, you know, people knew and stuff. People wanted to watch the movies in the theater. You know,
Hmm.
you brought, if I was to ask somebody on a date and stuff, I would take her to a movie.
Yeah.
It was just something we both wanted to do and stuff. So, um, I don't know if that's the same culture. Because I'm going to be 60, um, you know, next year. So I don't know how young people. I don't know, since you're a teacher, you know more about this than I do. I just don't know.
Mm.
I don't know as much about the younger generation anymore. I don't want to stereotype them and stuff. So
Right, right.
I'll
Hmm.
just say I don't know. But I just remember there were certain, and also some, but you were saying about how when things get too commercial. I remember most of the political music at that time was on the edges. So like in ska music, the Specials or the Clash or some rap music, most of the more political music that had some sort of strong, critique of capitalism was on
Hmm.
the edges and stuff, not so much in the um, so the
The
some of the
mainstream. Hmm.
yeah, so some of the I'm trying to think of a mainstream um
Well, Rage Against the Machine was in 1993,
yeah, that's the
1994.
90s. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was
Yeah.
a moment, I think, where mainstream was absorbing this critical critique of capitalism.
Yeah. I think in the 80s, Public Enemy,
Oh yes, that's true. Yeah.
Public Enemy, and
Mid
I'm
80s
thinking,
maybe.
yeah, but I'm like the Specials was a ska group from England, and I
Yes.
guess England at the time during the Thatcher era was, you know, they were facing a surge of white nationalism,
Hmm.
and the Specials was created especially as a multiracial group to fight against white nationalism through their music. And I think
Mm.
the Clash were very political and stuff. So, but trying to think of explicit. I think if you want to look politics, it was more sexual politics and stuff.
Hmm.
But the Clash, they're the ones that pop to mind. But I'm sure there are others. I know rap had some um, political content in their work and stuff because they were ahead of their time in expressing the struggles of inner city minority communities and stuff. They were one of the few people that were doing that actually at that time and stuff, and that was sort of in terms of capitalism, the outsourcing of manufacturing jobs from the inner cities to other countries and how that affected their communities and stuff. You know, you know, John Cougar Mellencamp, he did an album called Scarecrow. It's the same thing. How the farmers in the heartland were struggling because of Reagan's policies and stuff. So there was political music, and that was a mainstream album and stuff. So, but I don't know how much of the politics seeped through and stuff. So there were some main Springsteen had some political songs too, but um, yeah, I'm not an expert, but that's what I remember and stuff. So
Yeah, those are really good examples. I wasn't too knowledgeable about the Specials because I came in the music interest in music, and then my interest was more strongly in the late 90s, and I didn't really get a lot of the 80s influences of music.
no,
Because I was like,
I'm
I was listening to like Paul McCartney, or something in the 80s, and Michael
okay.
Jackson singing a duet or whatever. And then listening to the Rolling Stones and things like that. But
Yeah. The Stones were
I
the
didn't know
most
the English
political in
stuff.
the 60s. In the 60s, the Stones were political, but I think by the time the 80s came around, they got commercial and
Oh
stuff.
yeah, yeah. It was more like "Can't Get No Satisfaction" was kind of like a song that was popular in my head during that, because I
Yeah.
was listening to the 70s music in the 80s, and
Yeah.
I didn't have a political consciousness in the 80s, so I was more like just sort of listening to stuff that had a good groove.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, the role of popular culture is really important, and I think it does kind of go along with certain time periods. Like middle school, you have your favorite songs and movies, and then in high school, it's different, and then post high school, it's different. But
Yeah.
in terms of your middle school years, did you find that you were becoming socially conscious in the middle school years? And did that relate
Um,
to music and popular culture at all?
Kind of in a way. I mean, I've always been interested in politics. I used in fourth grade, my teacher, Mr. McGinnis, he would give extra points to anybody who'd read the news of the day. So
Hmm.
since I was a nerd and stuff, I wanted to get those points. So I would always read the paper and stuff.
Oh,
But but also, I mean, that was just an interesting time. Both that was just an interesting time for me because so much was going on and stuff. I mean, it was sad in the sense that there were a lot of assassinations during those years and stuff. John Lennon, Harvey Milk, Oscar Romero. You know, he got shot during that time, and so my. When you say middle school, you're talking about fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh grade, right? Around then and stuff. That was
yeah,
around,
like
yeah. So that
sixth,
was
seventh,
around,
eighth grade.
yeah, so I was getting more political, but in a superficial sense. I can't say my politics was in depth, but I loved reading comic strips, and Doonesbury was a comic strip I would read occasionally. And I think Bloom County, I don't know if I'm getting the dates right. Bloom
Mhm.
County was occasionally political and stuff, but I remember Doonesbury. In order to understand Doonesbury, you had to read the news and stuff. So that was that helped me because it forced me to read. But
Mhm.
also at that time, you're talking about pop culture, but religion played an important part and stuff because at that time, there was still a vibrant Catholic left and stuff. So because of my family's interest in the Philippines, the
Hmm.
Catholic Church was very important in helping the opposition in the Philippines against martial law. And I knew what was going on in El Salvador because that was just in the news a lot and stuff. So
Yeah.
Oscar Romero, and then the nuns who got killed and stuff. And a lot of Catholic leftists were still alive. Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, and stuff. So I knew sort of by osmosis what was going on, just because it was in music, in popular culture, but also in religion and stuff. At that time, I had very mixed feelings about John Paul II, and he was clashing with more liberal Catholics and stuff. But you had Catholics going to um, anti-nuclear, weapons protests, or the sanctuary movement. The Catholic Church was a big part of. The Catholic left, the progressive side of Catholicism, was an important influence on me and stuff. In terms of a critique of capitalism, Catholic Church has its own critique of capitalism too and stuff. So
Yeah, and that kind of relates a little bit or directly to with the Negros 19, right? Which is the April 19th, 2026 killing of 19 community activists that are supporting farmers,
yeah,
farm workers, farmers.
yeah.
And interestingly, the Google description makes it sound like it's a legitimate military action against
Uh,
insurgents. In fact, it's calling them insurgents. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, nine of the people were civilians and stuff, and I have a feeling if they were to do a thorough investigation, that
Hmm.
whatever that Google thing is would change and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if one of the calls for right now is to have an independent investigation to see what actually happened, and not just rely on the military reports of what happened and stuff, because you know, without any transparency and stuff, who knows what the military may be covering up and stuff. So
Right. So I guess this is just one example of where we can go from popular culture to, you know, political events, right? And there's kind of a smoother transition than we might suspect, right? But the
yeah,
surface, because one of the reasons that's true, I think, is because of the way that our consciousness moves, right? And our attention moves. And one of the things I try to teach students is that the reason that I think popular culture and reception of popular culture or consumption of it is important is because when we consume, our consciousness is focused on something, is meditating upon something particular, and then it shifts to a different object. And that transition, the way that our brain and mind moves from one topic to the next matters. You know what I mean? Because if you're
yeah,
looking at TikTok or something and you're looking at stupid animal tricks, and then you immediately switch gears, right? Your mind is shifting towards, the killing of 19 individuals who are trying to fight for rights.
yeah,
That has an effect on our consciousness. It isn't just random facts here, right? These are the sort of juxtapositioning of two different
yeah.
realities, right?
It's pretty jarring. Yeah,
Yeah, that we can be constantly just shifting from one idea to the next without any true contemplation.
yeah.
And that's designed by technology, right? That's technologists deciding that this is how we're going to consume.
Yeah, I think it's isn't. I read somewhere that the attention span of younger generations is a lot less than older generations and stuff.
Hmm.
Is that part of what you're talking about? Is that when you do these kind of jarring switches and stuff,
Hmm.
it shrinks the attention span, And having a social conscience requires some sort of deep thought and reflection upon what happens. And you can't have that if your attention span shrinks, I guess.
Yeah, the shrinking of the attention span is huge for educators. And there's all I'm sure there's all kinds of news articles that pop up in your feed about the challenge of teaching during this time period where, there's actually I think Nordic countries are on the cutting edge of this idea of like removing technology completely from certain classrooms, right?
Yeah,
And just teaching using handwritten notes and things like that
yeah,
as a way to recapture, I guess, the consciousness of our learners and ourselves even, right? Like as teachers, we have to sort of recapture that ability to pay attention and
yeah,
sustain attention.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I guess I was lucky in a way because I came of an age where where our generation, we still read books and stuff. We didn't, social media, what, 90s, 2000s mostly and stuff, so I came of an age before social media and stuff. So and people were complaining about television shrinking attention spans, but I
Hmm.
think there was always All in the Family and stuff that
Hmm.
where you had, there were certain was that still in the 80s or 70s? I guess the 70s. All in the Family still forced you to have a conversation and stuff. Like they take two opposing views and it forces you to have a debate and stuff. And I think that's good and stuff. You know, Democracy is about the clash of different ideas. So
Yeah. Yeah, those reruns were playing for me at least. And I grew up in Texas. We were watching the reruns of All in the Family, Good Times.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Any of those Norman Lear shows and stuff. Yeah,
yeah, they were being repeated over and over again. So we must have seen each episode probably like 20 times of a lot of those shows, over our childhood. Mm.
yeah, yeah. I liked them because they offered a view of like, you can disagree with somebody and still see their humanity and stuff. So
Yeah, yeah. Because they showed you most of the time they showed you enough of their lives, right?
yeah,
That you can see that they're human beings and not just sound bites embodied in human bodies.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, that speak to how we consume within these sort of like algorithmic bubbles, right, of our own political ilk, right? We kind of stay within that space,
yeah,
and it kind of dehumanizes those people that don't agree with us.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. My politics is pretty left wing, but I try to be careful
Mhm.
to because I used to, even though I'm pretty liberal, I used to have conservative friends and stuff.
Mhm.
I lost a lot of those friends, but I still remember, um, they're not just conservative. They're you know I saw their complexity as human beings and stuff, and because we were friends, I saw their good side and stuff. So it was painful to lose those friends. So yeah, I don't have much to, during my young years, I would have arguments about politics with friends and stuff, but the depth of my knowledge of politics at that time wasn't as the same at that time, just because I was you know I was being a kid, you know. So I remember uh, what was my first memory is the Carter Ford elections, but the first important elections was the Democratic primaries because I didn't like, my parents didn't like Carter, and I didn't like Carter, but I was hoping for Ted Kennedy, but I remember he was controversial, but he was an influence on my politics and stuff. I think the Ted Kennedy campaign and the Jesse Jackson campaign were both important
Mhm.
influences on my politics because both were more traditional kind of New Deal liberal type, not today's liberal, but a more what's the right word? Their liberalism was closer to the New Deal type liberalism.
Mhm.
So They both wanted this coalition of working class whites, minorities, and the poor. And that's been a big influence of my politics and stuff. Is I I see it as a goal, you know, how can we create those coalitions to that, to create changes that help all communities and stuff. So
So would you say that those coalition building campaigns were in response to the Southern strategy?
no, I think it was before the Southern strategy. I think the
Hmm.
Southern strategy was trying to break up those coalitions.
Hmm.
So, like, if you look at throughout most, if you look at the liberal Democrat left and if you look at the socialist left, both parts of the left were trying to build a coalition of working class whites, minorities, and the poor in the belief. One is that, and during most of the 20th century, the left was fueled by the labor movement and stuff. And there was a theory, like if you listen to A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Paul Robeson, they were influenced by the labor movement and their belief that racial equality, you know, racial equality needs to link up with economic justice issues and stuff, so that we need a large enough coalition to pressure the political system to change and stuff.
Hmm.
And in order, by itself, the civil rights movement um, just doesn't have the numbers. Any minority group fighting for their rights just doesn't have the numbers and stuff. And so the theory was that you need allies. And the biggest segment of the left was the labor movement. The labor movement was able to get the New Deal. And so the theory of like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Paul Robeson was that the Black community needed to have white allies within the labor movement. They needed to find some way of creating a coalition where both communities were fighting for common economic interests and stuff. So that was sort of the basis of the New Deal too and stuff. So um, I think the Southern strategy was trying to take away the white working class from that New Deal coalition, or that sort of leftist coalition, and I think they pretty
Hmm.
much succeeded and stuff. Whenever right wing Republicans were, if you can find a strategy to break up that coalition, the Democrats lose. Left wing causes um, take steps back instead of steps forward and stuff. So
Yeah.
when any progress you have, um, the backlash comes when you're able to get the white working class to see minorities as the enemy and stuff. Whereas in the coalition politics, if you look at Jesse Jackson's campaign, he was able to tell inner city Black communities and working class white communities and rural communities that you all three of you guys have all three of you communities have the same problems and stuff. And only by coming together can you succeed in getting the sort of economic and racial justice that's necessary for this country to get better and stuff.
Hmm.
So that was his message. That was Bobby Kennedy's message in 1968. That was Ted Kennedy's message in 1979 and stuff. Um, so but that's my mindset is trapped in that ideological framework. I don't know if I was mentioning I feel like an out of date leftist. I don't know if that framework still works because the white working class is so beholden to MAGA nowadays. I don't know if we can. I think I don't know if we can win them back and stuff. But Trump's policies hurt white working class communities. It doesn't make sense for me that they're MAGA and stuff. Um, but I don't have a solution to that problem. you know, I don't have a solution to that problem. But that's sort of my opinion. I don't know how applicable it is for today's political climate.
How does this fact possibly affect your cartooning work in terms of the things that you cover in your cartooning work? And I actually have a painting that you did in the past in my own wall, which I appreciate. Could you talk a little bit about that painting and then maybe address the question around like how does the politics affect your work in general? And does the painting behind me have anything to do with politics?
Yeah, not really, but it could if you want and stuff. I mean, like it's just this cat disguised as a dog trying
Yeah,
to go through a crowd of dogs and stuff. So
yeah.
this is one of my first paintings I had for my illustration course when I was in college. The first one that I got an A in and stuff. So I redid that painting and stuff. I like it and stuff, but it's more a sense of isolation and stuff. I during my college years, I didn't have a lot of self-esteem and stuff.
Mhm.
So I sometimes felt like a oddball in a crowd and stuff. But that was sort of more that emphasis. I think the way my politics affects my cartoons, I'm always in my cartoons. I focus on there's a saying among cartoonists. What's the saying again? To comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And
Mhm.
my politics is more the way my politics affects my cartoons is I always try to give this is what's happening to marginalized communities, highlight the issues affecting them, and I try not to follow the headlines when I do my cartoons. Some cartoonists do. What I want to do with my cartoons, what's going on in the Filipino American community, what's going on in the Philippines among marginalized groups in each community that people are not paying attention to, and put a spotlight on it. That's sort of my influence and stuff. So in my cartoons, I consider my cartoons a form of activism and stuff. So yeah, hold on. Let me turn off the phone for a second. Do you hear the
Okay.
phone? Do you hear the phone?
Yes, but I can pause. Let me pause.
Okay. Okay. I'll remind you to press.
Okay.
Okay, good.
All right.
Okay.
All right. So we're at part two of the interview with cartoonist Angelo Lopez. And you talked a little bit about growing up, I guess middle school, but in general, like do you have a firm community that did you have a firm community growing up that you felt connected to? And what were some
Yes.
places that you found yourself hanging out and feeling belonging?
Well, as going into high school, um, I got I was kind of a nerdy kid who felt inadequate around kind of cool people, right?
Mhm.
So but
Yeah.
I was lucky in the sense that I found a group of friends who were like me. We were kind of nerdy. We studied hard in school. We took school seriously. We basically, we listened to our parents and stuff. And in my neighborhood, like I mentioned before that I'm sort of a Navy brat. So my dad retired from Moffett Field. We moved to Sunnyvale, and a lot of my friends were in a similar situation where their fathers were in the military, and when they retired from Moffett Field, they moved to Sunnyvale, Mountain View, nearby areas and stuff. So we still had that kind of foundation. Most of my friends, um, Filipino American, Mexican American, Vietnamese American. Our parents were first generation immigrants and stuff. So we were second generation. Am I right? Is that second generation? We're like,
Mhm.
our parents came to America from the Philippines, Vietnam, Mexico, El Salvador, Germany and stuff. And we all had to face that sort of difference between first and second generation, where our parents were close to their cultural roots, and we were kind of navigating between being for me navigating between a Filipino identity and an American identity. But I was lucky in the sense that I found people who love comic books, I
Hmm.
found people who loved, watching movies. Um, I found people who loved basketball. I was lucky, in the sense after seventh grade, I never really was bullied or anything. So, and I found that kind of nerdy subset of people. I don't know if they would consider themselves nerdy, but we were all kind of like in that same kind of boat and stuff, and they were good friends and stuff. I was lucky to have them and
Yeah,
stuff.
it sounds like the kind of earnestness that you're talking about too. Like, would you feel like you would characterize yourself as being very focused and earnest in your endeavors over your
Um,
lifetime, or did that shift in? Did you ever feel cynical growing up, like when you saw things happening in politics or
um,
community changes and things?
I never felt cynical. I felt worried at times and stuff,
Okay, a
but
lot of worry.
yeah, I mean, I came from different, during the time I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, there was a ton of stuff going on and stuff. I mean, at that time, I was, up until the early 90s, I was a Catholic, and there was a ton of conflict within the Catholic Church. And, so um, you know, um, there was who was there? In the Philippines, the church going against Marcos, or in Latin America, the war movement. Um, not the anti-war. Well, actually, there was an anti-war movement, activist against the U.S. involvement in Latin America, supporting right-wing dictatorships, or supporting Marcos in the Philippines. There were activists, the anti-nuclear activists. There was, during, I didn't mention this, but during the AIDS crisis, there was activism against, against the Reagan and Bush administration's silence on the AIDS epidemic and stuff. For the AIDS activists, I only really knew about that during college because I was in the art department a lot, and there was a lot of people in the art department that were active in that movement. But I think my first friend who came out as gay was in 1990 and stuff. So that came relatively late in terms of my young adult life and stuff. So, and I remember when he came out, the first two things that popped up in my mind were, I hope he doesn't get beaten up, and I hope he doesn't get AIDS and stuff.
Mhm.
So, but so that sort of personalized the AIDS crisis for me. But I was not as knowledgeable about that and stuff. But um, what else? So yeah, but I was never cynical and stuff. I think because yeah, I was just worried, I guess, because I came from you know, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party was still strong and stuff. So Ted Kennedy, Walter Mondale, and especially Jesse Jackson. I was still hopeful. I think during the 90s, Bill Clinton and that kind of more centrist wing of the Democratic Party took over.
Mhm.
But in the 80s, there was still a strong liberal, Paul Wellstone, those type of more traditional liberals that were still close to the activist left and stuff. I think when Bill Clinton came along, there was a shift towards the more corporate Democrat and stuff. So, yeah, at least as a young adult, I never, I felt besieged at times because the Reagan era was not a fun era if you were on the left, But I never. I think if I was part of a different part of the left, so like if I was uh, if I was involved in the AIDS activist movement, that would be more cynical and stuff because it was
Mhm.
just at a time when people were dying and stuff. A lot of social conservatives were really demonizing gay people at a time when they were really hurting and stuff, and so if I was more part of that part of the left, I think I'd be more cynical. But I don't think I was. My focus, my knowledge of that was more peripheral and stuff. So does that answer your question or?
Yes, and you were part of the church from which years? Catholic Church?
I was part of the Catholic Church until the early 90s and stuff. So my first 23, 24, my first my
Early
first
20s.
yeah, until my early 20s. I'm trying to remember like 93, 92 and stuff.
And
So
were your parents going to church as well or no?
oh, they regularly even they've always been devout, regular church going members and stuff, but they were more
Oh.
conservative. Yeah, so they remain Catholic and stuff, and I think my siblings remain Catholic too. I think for me, there was no even though I didn't like John Paul and
Mhm.
stuff, I still I'm even now I'm still influenced by the progressive side of Catholicism. It's just
Mm.
that in the early 90s. Um, and I didn't have to drift from the church. There was no real reason, but because a lot of progressive Catholics stayed in the church in spite of John Paul and stuff. But for me, I just drifted away and stuff. It seemed like John Paul was successful in suppressing a lot of the more progressive side of Catholicism. But you know, you know that's one reason. But I didn't really have to drift away, but I just did and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was around that same time I think I also drifted away, but I started going when I was about 16 or 15
Oh,
to the Catholic Church on my own, and then I left around that age 21 or so, maybe 20.
yeah,
But one of the reasons was that we lost our pastor. So we had a gay youth pastor.
yeah,
And, he was kind of the link between us and the community of
yeah.
Catholics, and of course, my friend's parents went to the same church, et cetera. Did you see anything like that happen within the church where there was conservatism starting to show up in different spaces?
Well, yeah, I think because I saw that in the 70s. There was a huge clash between when John Paul came, there was this feeling among more conservative Catholics that Vatican II was going too fast and
Hmm.
people weren't able to adjust and stuff. And so
Hmm.
John Paul wanted to, and like-minded Catholics wanted to, they didn't want to get rid of Vatican II, but they wanted to stop any further reforms and stuff. Where I tended to side with the Catholics who wanted to continue the reforms, so.
Hmm.
But in the 70s and 80s, there was still the liberation theology proponents. There were the more social justice Catholics who marched with the farm workers, the labor priests and stuff. There were um, and the critique of capitalism, the anti-nuclear activists, the churchgoers that supported the sanctuary movement. There was a vibrant Catholic left that John Paul and Benedict pretty much stifled and stuff. But if I was going to a Jesuit church or something, I might have stayed, or because if there was Santa Clara University, which is nearby and
Hmm.
stuff, was a more progressive Catholic church and stuff. But my parents attended Our Lady of Peace in Santa Clara, which is a fairly more conservative church. But I never felt you know there's the intellectual reasons, but there's also an emotional thing and stuff. I just
Hmm.
in the early 90s, I'd broken up with my first girlfriend. I was feeling down on myself. I there was no real there was you, you know I was only a 15 minutes away for Santa Clara U. I could have attended their church instead of Our Lady of Peace, but um, there was no real reason why I drifted. It's just that I felt a sense of disconnection from everything and stuff at
Yeah.
that time, and so I drifted away. But you know, but that sense of wanting, your questions have to do with community.
Hmm.
That sense of wanting to belong to a community never left and stuff. So the void that the Catholic Church felt, I needed to fill somehow and stuff. So, and at that, I'd left college. most of my high school and college friends were and moved to different spaces and stuff, like different states. Were trying to establish themselves as young adults, and we were, when you in high school, you see your friends every day. Once you become a young, once you graduate and become a young adult and stuff, um, you don't, you don't see your friends every day anymore and stuff, right? So, um, you know, um, I think community happens when you see people on a consistent basis and stuff. And in my early 20s, um, um, I had to make the effort. Whereas in school, you don't have to make an effort. You're just there.
Now, you mentioned that you had a teacher, McGinnis, I think, and another teacher that really created a
Oh, yeah.
sense of connection.
Yeah. In my fourth grade, Mr. McGinnis, uh,
Hmm.
yeah, he was wonderful and stuff. He was in my fourth grade Wisman School in
Hmm.
Mountain View, uh,
Yeah.
and then in seventh, I think eighth grade, Mrs. Bacher in Madrone in Sunnyvale. Those are my two favorite teachers. But I've always liked most of my teachers. I liked,
Yeah.
but those were my two favorite, Mr. McGinnis and Mrs. Bacher and stuff. And I think they made learning fun,
Hmm.
and I loved everybody in my fourth grade class, and I pretty much loved everybody in my. I think Miss Bacher taught English and social studies and stuff in my eighth grade class and stuff. I liked everybody in both classes and stuff. So I enjoyed going to their classes, and they made learning fun and stuff. So Mr. McGinnis, he was into he loved science and stuff, and so we took field trips to hunt fossils. He took us to he lived in Lake Tahoe, which is weird because he it sounds like he commuted from Lake Tahoe to
Wow.
Mountain View. So I'm guessing that during the week he probably lived in a locally, and then during the weekends he went to Tahoe and stuff. But he instilled in us a love of learning, and he made us feel he made us feel like a group and stuff because I remember one time he treated the entire class to Chinese food for lunch, right?
Hmm.
And we would just I just felt close to everybody in that class and stuff. And I remember the kids from the other classes would look at us kind of jealously as we were eating Chinese food, right? And it was the same thing with Mrs. Bacher. She was kind of eccentric, but
Hmm.
eccentric in a fun way and stuff. And
Yeah.
so, and she allowed us, to be ourselves and stuff. It's nice to be able to be yourselves and stuff.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I learned a lot from both of them and stuff. So
Yeah, that's it. That kind of says a lot about belonging because I think there's definitely like a person that directs the tone, right, of the space.
yeah, yeah,
And I'm not always just one person, but when it's a teacher in a classroom, there's definitely like a way in which they set the tone. And I think it doesn't hurt that you loved learning
yeah,
because that's what they do. They teach, you know. So it's like playing tennis with somebody who really wants to play with you, you know.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah,
that says a lot about, you know, why people belong to a space is that there's somebody kind of curating the space to some degree.
yeah.
And when you were working in the library, you were there for about 30 years or so. You probably, you know, you might have had a strong feeling about, you know, whether you belonged or didn't. How did you feel about working in that space, in those two spaces?
Um, I worked in two libraries, the Santa
Hmm.
Clara Public Library and the Sunnyvale Public Library. I mean, in the Sunnyvale Public Library, just because I worked for a decade, every once in a while I would have my tensions with a coworker, but
Yes.
overall, I felt very proud to be working in the library. But in
Yes.
terms of a community, I think it's my time working in the children's department of the Santa Clara Public Library in the 90s that I felt the closest because I became very close friends with one of the librarians, Jan
Hmm.
Lieberman.
Hmm.
Jan and her husband, Don Lieberman, they were like 40 years older than me, but we bonded there was a moment in the 90s where every once a week I would drop by their house and we would just hang out and stuff, and they would uh, they would take me to movies. We both love movies. So we would go to the Stanford Theater and watch old movies and stuff. On Wednesday nights, they used to have a silent movie night, and they would take me to the movies. And after we'd hang out, watch a movie, we'd go to their place and we'd get scoops of our favorite ice cream. And we'd talk for hours about books and music and history. Both of us loved history. And so
Mhm.
we would talk about history. We talk about the books that we read. We talk about the movies that we loved. And so from them, I gained an appreciation of jazz and classical music. Before them, I didn't know anything about classical music or jazz and stuff. And I
Mhm.
learned about Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and Aaron Copland and all of that stuff that I didn't know before and stuff. And I think in my lifetime, until I met my wife, the Liebermans were probably my closest friends. And
Mhm.
through them, I learned about children's books and certain, we would talk about history a lot and stuff. And that was a lot of fun and stuff. So, um, you know, I think, you gain community where people have like-minded interests and you can just laugh. Laughter, I think, is an important part of community where you laugh, you enjoy each other. Whenever I had personal problems, I would always go to them for advice and stuff.
Mhm.
And, the sense of vulnerability, I guess, where you can be vulnerable and be yourself and, and they would listen with empathy and stuff. And I think they brought out the best in me, in the
Mhm.
90s, especially. I kind of felt like a loser because my art was going nowhere and stuff. And they kept on encouraging me, you keep on keep you're a good artist, keep going
Mhm.
and stuff. And my wife's the same way. She so I think that sense of you want somebody who you can feel yourself with, but who also bring out the best in you and stuff. And the Liebermans did that for me and stuff. So so for them it was that close, really tight knit friendship with them that that I loved and stuff. And I miss them. They both passed away.
Right, yeah. So with that friendship, did you have something like that when you were like in high school or later high school as you're getting into older teens
Oh yeah, yeah,
before
yeah.
before going to college?
Yes, there was a group of like 8 friends, 8 or 9 friends and stuff that I was really
Mhm.
tight knit with. And then my first girlfriend and stuff. All of us, we got along pretty well and stuff. So, and I like, I think the last time we felt really close and tight knit was around actually 92 and stuff when I broke up with my first girlfriend. Those friends, they were worried about me. And so for about a year, they would call me up every week and just make sure I was doing something and stuff to make
Mhm.
sure I didn't wallow in grief and stuff. And so um, they were good friends. It was from maybe junior high to my early 20s and stuff. They helped keep me afloat and stuff and it was the same thing. We would hang out, go to movies. We were kind of a nerdy bunch, so we didn't do anything uh, um, crazy or anything. We would just do normal things. We would, um, you know, one friend, she knew how to do apple dumpling. I forget what it was, soup. And in my 20s and stuff, I didn't know how to cook, so she didn't want me to starve to death as I as I tried to live on my own. So she and her boyfriend at the time would invite me to eat at their place and stuff, and I would just have I just remember a lot of laughter, a lot of spontaneous outings where we would just like during college. One friend invited me to go to the beach with her and another friend, and we would just kind of study while sitting in the beach.
Mhm.
we, so I just remember having a lot of fun and stuff, and
Yeah.
and yeah, we would watch movies together. We would just do a lot of stuff together and stuff. But I think it's natural, I think, for anybody. And as you graduate and as you go out into the world and stuff, um, you know, you have those friendships, but you're trying to, people move or people get relationships or people.
Hmm.
I think when that happens, they're they're you're still friends, but they're no longer there. Their time becomes consumed with creating their own lives. And I think with me, it's the same thing with me. I had a lot of growing up to do in my 20s and stuff. So and 30s and stuff because in order to in order to become to mature, there were certain things I had to do on my own because the goals in my life were not necessarily the same as the goal in other people's lives. So in my third 20s and 30s, I went to this Asian American church, and the first few years of that church, maybe the first 4 or 5 years, I developed close friends in that church.
Hmm.
Um, that when my high school and college friends began into their own lives, I had a new community to go to and stuff. And for the first few years, it was wonderful and stuff. But then after that, the same thing happened. They started the close friends from that church started getting married or and stuff. And I think there were sort of ideological problems too, because of I mentioned that I used to have conservative friends. A
Hmm.
lot of those the the political differences that were not a hindrance in the first few years, they were not the primary reasons that I left the church, but it started to show and stuff,
Hmm.
so
So when you left high school, you left behind those sort of nine friends that you were really close to. How did
yeah.
you, sort of cope with the transition into not being around them all the time? Or was there?
It was the church friends.
Oh yeah, it went right
They
into
filled that
church.
void,
Okay.
and but then also my friend the Liebermans too and stuff.
Okay.
And I think in the 90s I was fairly close to a lot of people in Santa Clara Public Library, and I had a few friends in Sunnyvale too and stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's similarly, I think after high school I was working at a video store and that created a kind of connection
yeah,
that it was almost like a mini high school because you go in for like your 7 hour shift and you would, bond with those folks, maybe go out afterwards with a
yeah,
couple
yeah,
of them. So that the way in which we kind of like transition from having that constant interaction with friends to the sporadic, like, work schedule or whatever, it really just kind of becomes a continuity that subconsciously maybe we just kind of
yeah.
re-engage in the way that we did in high school to some degree.
Yeah. And I'm guessing that the people in that video store, were they similar in age to you?
Yeah, there was a
Yeah.
little bit of a range around my age, but there was the older uncle types that were like, "Oh, I'm, 30 something and I'm working at this video store as a manager," versus like
Oh,
the people that were the regular workers like me that were like, in their late teens, early 20s.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. I think my friendship with the Liebermans was unusual in the sense that they were 30, 40 years older than me and stuff. But my friends in the Chinese American church, we were all in our 20s and early 30s. So, and they were starting out their careers. Most of them had not been in relation. All of us were still most of us were still single and stuff. So it was almost like a transition into a different high school. It was sort
Yeah.
of in the sense. I think what happens is when communities disperse is when you reach an age, you get a relationships, you get
Yeah.
you get really deep into your job careers, and that's what splits up. Um, at least in my experience, that's what split up um, different social circles and stuff. And then starting in the 2000s, it became political polarization destroyed former friendships and stuff, which was very painful and stuff. But
Mm.
up until the 90s, it was not politics. It was more um, um, just the facts of life. You know, when you enter a transition in your life, you just don't have time anymore. Or they didn't have time for me, you know, because they were focused on their jobs, or they were focused in on their new marriages, or they just had a kid and they were starting their families. And
Hmm.
at the time, I felt hurt at times not having enough time. But now that I'm older, you know, I have the maturity now to see that you know, that was inevitable. You know, that if you have a new relationship, you have to spend time nurturing that relationship. Or if
Yeah.
you're in a job, and especially if you have a job that you love and stuff, you spend time in that job because you want to, you know, those are just natural transitions in life. And that uh, now that I'm older, I understand it and stuff. That you know, things that I was hurt at kind of when I was younger, I realize now it's not their fault and stuff. You know, they're not trying to, you know, it's not a conscious thing on their part. It's just their transition to life made them realize, you know, made them put them in that direction and stuff. So, but I still have a few old friendships from that, you know, from that time, you know. But my relationship I'm focused now and right now is my wife and stuff. And now I'm caregiving and stuff. And because I'm caregiving, I just don't have time to devote to certain friendships, you know, or the my community, my social circles shrunk a lot just because I just, you know, my mother-in-law and my father need me and stuff to do things and stuff. So um, and it, you know, that makes me, you know, realize that life, you know, there are certain times in life where you have the time to devote, but then there's certain times when um, um, other relationship um, demand more time just because of health or just you know, or crisis or something. I don't know if that makes sense or.
Yeah, it does. And you mentioned that political polarization in the 90s affected your relationships. How did the politics affect your cartooning work and
Oh,
yeah, different periods?
um, well, I started cartooning in 2008, my
Okay.
political cartoons. And um, gosh, during that time, um, you know, you know, I would always mention to my friends that, you know, I'm liberal and stuff and stuff. My politics is to the left.
Hmm.
And, but, you know, but they, you know, they never dove too deep into that and stuff. What does it mean and stuff? Once I started doing political cartoons, um, my politics was no longer vague. You know,
Yeah.
you know, once they saw what I was attacking or what positions I was holding and stuff, it was pretty blatant in my cartoons. So
Yeah.
something that was left unsaid was no longer left unsaid and stuff. And so the stark political differences I had with some of my friends that were once um, I guess left unsaid have now become obvious to them. And as the times got more polarized and stuff, in the 90s and 80s, I have friends from a wide spectrum, you know, from I
Hmm.
had Marxist friends, I had conservative Christian friends, I had libertarian, you know, but the friendship was more important than the politics and stuff. Something happened in the 2000s where in quite a few of those relationships, the politics became more important than the friendship. Does that make sense and stuff? Is that
Yeah, 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 yeah. I guess you're doing the work, you're getting more integrated with it and more, I guess, committed to those positions, maybe,
um, yeah,
or
I
having
get
to
you.
defend them.
Yeah,
Some.
yeah. I guess I'll go. I may change my mind on that once I
Yeah,
think
yeah. No, that's
something
fine.
that.
I'm just trying to frame it to just to kind of give us something to launch off of, like
Okay, yeah.
like
So
um
like, you know, like you know, my you know, it became obvious I was pro-choice. It
mhm,
became obvious that I supported same-sex marriage.
Hmm.
it became obvious that my take on capitalism was a lot more I'm a lot more critical than a lot of my friends who were pro-business, who owned a
Hmm.
small, who owned a business, or were more fiscal conservative, or
Yeah.
and such, or and some of those issues, you can, it used to be that with my friendships with people who I disagreed with, I would be able to say, I agree with you in A, B, and C, but I
Yeah.
disagree with you in D, E, and F. And
Hmm.
even though we would disagree on certain points, there were still points of common ground. Was, I think, what would happen, especially with my conservative friends. And I blame Fox News for this, but
Hmm.
I think I have a theory that as my more conservative friends began consuming things like Fox News and right wing media, there became a thing where if you don't agree with me 100% and stuff, you're not, this person's not going to like me, that kind
Hmm.
of attitude and stuff. And it's hard to have a friendship when because I don't agree with anybody 100%. I'm right some of the time, I'm wrong some of the time, and I think that's true of everybody. Everybody's right some of the time, everybody's wrong some of the time. So if you expect me to agree with you 100% on anything, there's no hope for that friendship and stuff. We're just gonna because that's an impossible thing. I love my wife, and my wife loves me, but she doesn't agree with me 100%.
Right.
We disagree a lot and stuff, but
Yes.
I still love her and stuff. And I think with her, our relationship works because we can agree to disagree. um, in past, with friendships with across when I had a wide diversity of, friendships across the ideological divide, you know, there was this sort of unstated agreement that, you you know we you know our friendship is more important than our ideological differences, but there were still areas where we had common ground and stuff. When you deny the idea of having common ground and stuff, it's a bad basis. It's the tensions will increase and stuff.
Hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense and stuff. That's been my experience with the loss of my conservative friends and stuff.
Hmm.
My friends who are farther to the left than me, I haven't had that much. I have had some tensions and stuff, but I don't think, but it's nothing as bad as what that's happened to my more conservative friends and stuff. That hurt and stuff. So, um,
I want to share this image here because I was thinking about free speech and how when there's a kind of movement in the right around alternative facts and sort of fracturing our sense of what's true and what's not, or what's possibly
yeah,
empirical evidence of oppression. So if you change the rules of the game, then right, there's no oppression,
yeah,
there's no basis for demand for rights or
yeah,
demand for inclusion if there's no, reality. And so I think that strategy has had a lot of negative effects on consciousness and mental health for a lot of our young and old.
yeah.
So or can you talk about this piece a little bit in terms of like free speech?
Well, this particular cartoon has to do with the Philippines.
Mm,
And so in the Philippines and stuff, and not just the Philippines, but all over the world and stuff, is the sort of censoring, and this has to do more with red tagging and stuff.
yeah.
Duterte and Marcos tactic, and of autocrats all over the world, and especially with Trump now and stuff,
Hmm.
is the sort of disappearance of journalists, lawyers, activists, anybody who's critical of an autocratic government or right wing movements. They
Hmm.
they slowly, they silence them. They get them to disappear and stuff. And so, you know what red tagging is, right?
So
Um,
essentially, like labeling somebody as a communist or
yeah,
as somebody who's an insurgent when they're just protesting oppression.
yeah, yeah. So this is similar to what happened in America in the McCarthy area. era,
Hmm. Yeah.
where you accuse somebody of being a communist subversive, and that gives you the right to harass them, to imprison them, to get them stuck in the courts, to get them to not be able to get a job and stuff. So in the Philippines, um, you know, the Duterte had a directive. I forget what the directive was, where that allowed the military and the Philippine National Police to be able to target certain groups, journalists, lawyers, activists, church workers, uh,
Hmm.
indigenous rights activists. Anybody who criticizes the government, they can be harassed. You know, first in social media, they put out um, posts accusing an individual of being a communist insurgent, or
Hmm.
and then so they get harassed, they can be put to jail, sometimes they can even get killed and stuff. And so you know and this is a tactic not only of the Philippines but all over the world. Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, I think. All of these places where right wing governments are in ascendance and stuff. It's the same tactic that Duterte used and stuff. And Marcos is the disappearance of critical voices, disappearance of professions that try to act as a check and balance to autocratic power and stuff. They sort of disappear and stuff. And so the democratic right of free press, free expression, the right to dissent and stuff disappears along with these groups and stuff. So journalists, lawyers, human rights lawyers in the Philippines, all of these groups have been targeted by both the Duterte and the Marcos administrations. So, yeah. Does that answer your question? Or
Yes, very much. And do you see parallels during the different Trump elections and the current Trump administration? Or today it's May 30th, 2026, and
yes,
we've already
yeah,
experienced two versions of that.
yeah. Well, I mean, and just I had a talk with a Indian political cartoonist, Rajita Taniya. She'd won the 2024 Courage in Cartooning Award, and because she had been put on trial by I think the Indian government because of her cartoons criticizing the government and criticizing Hindu nationalism. And she was telling me that comedians in India are being targeted because they make fun of the government. They make fun of Hindu nationalism and stuff.
Mhm.
And so in America, it's not, you have targeting by the MAGA people, where they would troll and harass anybody who disagrees. But now Trump is using the government he's using the FCC to target comedians, Jimmy
Mhm.
Kimmel, Stephen Colbert. They're using the pressure from the government to um, if you have a contract with the government, they and you know that a particular company needs that contract to maintain profit. They can
Mhm.
use that as an extortion
Mhm.
to leverage the private company to do Trump's will and stuff. And much like Duterte did in the Philippines, where for the Philippines Daily Inquirer, um, the you know it was sold to a person who was friendly to Duterte and stuff, or he would use. In the Philippines, there's something I'm not sure why they have this, but there's something in order to use the airwaves that's owned by the government, private companies need to renew their franchise. So ABS-CBN was denied the franchise, and they were because Duterte was critical of them because of their coverage of the extrajudicial killings. So
Mhm.
um, Duterte allies in the legislature denied ABS-CBN the franchise in 2019, 20, I forgot when, and stuff, to so that, and if you deny the government airways, that severely reduced ABS-CBN's reach to the to the Filipino people. And so without the franchise and stuff, they've had to do alternative means of relaying their shows, and their ability to reach out to a wider Philippine audience was severely cut and stuff. And so less people are able to see their critical coverage of extrajudicial killings or anything critical of the Duterte government. And I don't think, I'm not sure, but I'll have to research, but I don't think their franchise was renewed under the Marcos government and stuff. And so I think with the Trump administration, they're taking the playbook out of the Duterte government, in that the use of the government agencies to either blackmail or extort um, or yeah, harass um, critics of the government and stuff. So I see what frightens me about the second Trump term is he's adopting a lot of the tactics that Duterte used during Duterte's term of office.
Yeah. And so kind of taken together, we talked about, growing up, we talked about your work, and we talked a bit about the politics around oppressive politics around free speech. In terms of national belonging, has your sense of national belonging to this nation changed over time, or how have you experienced all these shifts and changes in your own sense of belonging?
Well, I think I first felt a sense of belonging as an American in
Hmm.
1976 because that was the bicentennial and stuff. And
Hmm.
but I think I've had my struggles and stuff as a
Hmm.
Filipino American and stuff. I during junior high and high school, especially, I as I met Filipinos who came from the Philippines, and they would question me, why don't you know the language? Why don't you know the culture? So I kind of struggled at that time with a sense of, am I a Filipino or am I American and stuff?
Hmm.
And so my sense of being a Filipino, I struggled with that until my freshman year of college and stuff. And so that was a weird year. It was 1986. I took an Asian American class, Dr. Lu in San Jose State, where I read the book America's in the Heart by Carlos Bulasan. And his sense of, you know, I think it sounded like he had a similar struggle and stuff. But
Hmm.
but that book and that class and my classmates at that time really helped me. And that was also the year of the People Power Revolution, where the Philippines overthrew the Filipino people overthrew the Marcos dictatorship, and I felt very proud of my Filipino heritage and stuff. And my first girlfriend was Filipina, uh, and she accepted me for who I was. She never criticized me for not knowing the culture or not knowing the language and stuff. She just liked me and stuff, and I liked her, and I liked her family and stuff. And I think all three of those things helped me kind of resolve the struggle I had when I was younger. That I can love being an American, but I can also love my Filipino heritage and stuff. But also, there are figures in American history
Hmm.
that struggled. Um, Martin Luther King in his last speech before he got killed, he said, you know, um, we're fighting for America to be true to what it says on paper.
Hmm.
American high ideals and stuff. You know, the Soviet Union is not preaching about freedom of speech. The Soviet Union is not preaching about freedom and equality. America is preaching that and stuff. And
Hmm.
we're here to say that, you know, um, you know, as Americans, we want Americans, as African Americans, we demand that America be true to what it says on paper.
Hmm.
If you really believe in freedom and equality and stuff, we're here to tell you that we want you to live up to your high ideals and stuff. And so I think the best in America is the best. When okay, as a Filipino American, I admire those Americans who were against American imperialism and the Philippine American War. So Mark Twain, W.E.B. Du Bois,
Hmm.
Ida B. Wells. All of them were Americans who were anti-imperialists who saw the wrong of the Philippine American War, or the anti-war protesters, in the Vietnam War, or the those Americans who spoke out against the genocide of the Native American population, or the abolitionists who saw the evil of slavery and stuff. All of them, in the sense, um, the AIDS activists, who saw the evil of of um, of of the response to the AIDS crisis and stuff,
Hmm.
or that um, that the I think those activists are telling America that you know we want America to live up to the values that it says it.
Hmm. Yeah.
So that's what makes me. That's why I'm in the left and stuff.
Hmm.
Is that I always see the American left as you know capitalism actually doesn't. You can't have political equality without economic equality.
Hmm.
That's and if you why now do we see billionaires having so much more power over our democratic institutions than the average person?
Hmm.
You know, um, you know, um, you know, and Eugene Debs, the socialist American socialist, or the New Dealers and stuff, realize that um, you know, um, people who have power and financial interests are so much better at 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 skewing the political system to
Hmm.
um, um, to what's the right word um, to take into account their interests rather than the interests of struggling working class or poor people
Yes.
stuff. And how do and we need to, if we want America to live up to its highest values, how do we act as a check on that, so that
Hmm.
poor and working class people can have their interests met and stuff. So
Yeah.
I don't know, does that make sense? Or
Yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah, on a national level, and also going back to the local level. So the project Spaces of Belonging is also about the sort of cultural aspects or cultural politics of belonging to a space, whether it's
oh,
local
okay.
or national. And I wanted to kind of juxtapose the national with the local by talking
Okay.
a little bit about, or just having you talk a little bit about your understanding of Japantown or Pinoy Town in San Jose, where there's this street called Jackson Street where there's plenty of community businesses that are local, but the question around whether they're tied to a long history of, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, Chinese Americans, or if it's more of a gentrifying space like most spaces, right, in San Jose that are popular, where wealthier folks are moving in and working class people or lower middle class people are having to move out. Um, what is your sense of that as a kind of space of belonging for Asian Americans? And even non-Asian Americans love that space, right? It was voted one of the most popular, um, areas of San Jose. I think in
Oh,
2023, I think it was like the top neighborhood or something like that in terms of
yeah.
vibrancy and belonging or something like that. So, what is your sense of that, and what interested you in that space?
Well, I mean, I used to live in downtown San Jose in the 90s and stuff. And that's always been, I used to ride my bike around there all the time and stuff. But I think I did a talk with, Robert Ragsack and Tom
Mm-hmm.
Eason about it and stuff. And I love the history. But I think part of the vibrancy is the sense that, it keeps the history alive. There's quite a few museums there. There's,
Hmm.
so you can learn about the history.
Hmm.
Tom and Robert are making a concerted effort to keep the history of the Japanese American and the Filipino American communities alive and stuff. There's a Filipino community center there. There's
Hmm.
various murals there and stuff, and I think there's various markers where, like, if you go to the spot, it'll tell you a little bit about the history of Japantown, or Robert gives tours about the history of Pinoy Town and stuff. I think that sense of the vibrancy, I think, comes partially from that. They keep history alive and stuff, and so there's a Buddhist temple there and stuff. And my wife and I and our nieces, when they were younger, I forgot the name of the festival. They would have festivals occasionally there, and when they do and stuff, it was very vibrant and stuff. It was very cool. And a lot of people there were young and stuff. They
Hmm.
would go to these festivals. I would see people riding bikes coming there and stuff. And I think part of it's accessibility, part of it is keeping history alive, and part of it is a sense of the Buddhist temple. This is only a theory of mine, but I'm guessing that the Buddhist temple keeps a little bit of that history alive and stuff, that sense of connection to that community.
Hmm.
I think one of the things about one of the dangers of gentrification is that um, you know, I don't know how many of the older generation of Japanese Americans are still there and stuff.
Hmm.
As they die off and stuff, and as young people, um, young professionals come, I'm wondering. I think I think we mentioned this last time, but you were mentioning how housing prices can price out the working class people and
Hmm.
stuff. And part of the danger of gentrification is the sense that um, um, uh, as housing, I think the same problem is happening in the Mission District in San Francisco, is
Hmm.
that um, as rents, as housing prices rise and stuff, um, uh, a higher income um, group of people will replace the older working class people who live there. And the danger is that you know the the sense of a historical connection may be lost due to gentrification and stuff. The historical um, connection, the sense of a certain generation and a certain demographic of people who have a fondness for the historical ties may be lost for a newer residents who may not have that historical or I guess ethnic connection to Japantown or Pinoy Town and stuff. Like, I don't know how many Filipino Americans are still in that area and stuff. Will 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 the Philippine Community Center still attract people to come there and stuff, or will it be all outsiders who don't live in the neighborhood and stuff? You know, um, um, what's the percentage of Japanese Americans who still live in Japantown and stuff? You know, will the Japanese American connection be through the temple, or will it just be will residents actually be going there, or will it be people who are outside the neighborhood be going there? And will the connection be through outsiders who are drawn into the area through festivals or museums or the temple? I don't have an answer. I don't know and stuff. So I'm not. I don't think I have the answer to your question about vibrancy, but I'm guessing. Um, how gentrification happens and how it changes the demographic of Japantown, the Japantown area, will have a lot to do with the vibrancy of the area and stuff.
Did you notice any changes when the COVID-19 struck, and did you see any changes to the neighborhood, or did you notice anything, or did Robert Ragsack or Tommy Zoo say anything about
Um,
um, the effect of COVID on the community there?
No,
And
I didn't ask that
yeah.
question. I was mostly asking about what was their experience like, maybe in the 30s and 40s about that
Hmm.
neighborhood. I was especially curious to know how did Pinoy Town react in 1930 during the Watsonville riots and stuff. So I was trying to connect more to the past. I don't, if I remember correctly, I don't think I might have asked, but maybe I don't think I did and stuff. But I do, you know, I admire their passion for keeping history alive and for giving tours and stuff. So
Hmm.
I recommend to anybody to contact either one of them to to give a tour and to get a spoken word history from people who actually experienced it and stuff, because I'm not sure how old they are and stuff, but when that generation passes away and stuff, that's a connection that's lost and stuff. I think one of the reasons I gave an interview with them is I wanted to be able to record um, a little bit of what they were saying before they're gone and stuff. So
So the Watsonville riots was essentially a racial motivated riot against Filipino farm workers.
yeah, what happened in 1930 was, but there was a lot of anti-Filipino sentiment at that time. It was a general anti-immigrant.
Hmm.
Um, the 20s was a very um, racist time.
Yeah.
The
A lot of
revival.
it around industry, right?
Yeah, in the
Mhm.
sense that there was a resentment among white, I guess, white farm workers, that Filipino farm workers were stealing their jobs and stuff,
Hmm.
and they were they dared to fraternize with with white women and stuff.
Hmm.
Which, if you're not going to allow Philippine women to migrate to America, that's going to happen and stuff.
Hmm.
So you put Filipino farm workers in an impossible situation and stuff, and then you know
Yeah, nature
obviously,
takes its course in a sense, right?
yeah. I mean, and so I learned. I did a talk and stuff. Um, there's a thing called the Tubera Project, and the Watsonville is in the Heart Initiative. And there's a person named Roy Riccio who founded the Tubera Project to try to preserve the memories of the of the Filipino Americans in Watsonville. And there sort of was generational trauma from the Watsonville riots and stuff, and that for future later generations were reluctant to talk about it because they knew of the prejudices against Filipino Americans and stuff. So, but so for a couple of days and stuff, there was a group of maybe 500 white people who went around attacking Filipino Americans because there was a dance where Filipinos dance with white women and stuff, and that incited a sort of how dare Filipinos dance with fraternize and dance with white women and stuff, and so one person got killed, Furman Tobera, I think his name
Hmm.
was, and several people got beaten up badly, and it spread. And there were other places in the western coast where there were anti-Filipino attacks and stuff. So, but I think it was the worst in Watsonville and stuff. And so they tried to preserve that memory and stuff. And it's not. Some people think of it as anti-white. It's not anti-white. We just want white people to not make the same mistakes again and stuff.
Hmm.
I'm married to a white woman from Watsonville, so
Hmm.
I think I'm not against white people. I just think that in the same way that we want Germans and Japanese to learn about the mistakes of World War II, we don't want the Germans to go back to Nazism. We don't want the Japanese to go back to fascism and stuff. We want them to learn the history so they don't make the same mistakes and fall back into fascism. In the same way, we don't want white Americans to forget the lessons of the past and fall back into right wing, our American version of fascism. And fascism means, when Americans turn, the Jim Crow South was basically, um, you know, it was not a democracy if a large percentage of the population can't have citizenship rights and
Hmm.
stuff. So anytime any country moves towards right wing, towards fascism, vulnerable minority groups get hurt and stuff. Our rights get taken away. We become targets of discrimination and prejudice and hate and stuff. So in the 30s and stuff, it was Filipinos who were this target and stuff. In the 40s, it was Japanese Americans and stuff. Um, African Americans faced it throughout the entire country's history and stuff, right? We want progress. I mean, the reason we're called progressives is we want to improve as a nation. We want progress. We don't want we don't we don't want to go through this again. you know,
Right.
we my parents came here because they wanted they wanted better opportunities and conditions than they had in the Philippines and stuff. And so uh, I don't know. Am I straying from your question? I forgot your
No, not at
question.
all.
Okay, I forgot.
What? Wait,
I'm starting to rant, so I'm trying to hold. I'm trying not to rant.
no, no. So in terms of the final question is like reflecting on the long haul of your life, the history of your own life. How do you see your changing sense of community over time? Do you see that it's being affected by different forces around you? And has your sense of community more recently felt, a sense of belonging?
um, Yeah, in the sense that I mean, I'm closer to family now and stuff,
Hmm.
especially as I'm caregiving. But um, a couple of years ago, I went to my sister's wedding, and I
Hmm.
began to realize I think because I'm 10 years older, 10,
Hmm.
15 years older than my cousins, I never really was close to them just because of the age difference. It's
Hmm.
only as an adult, when at my sister's wedding, I realized, I really like my cousins and stuff.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so I made an effort to try to hang out with my cousins more. And I've been organizing these family get-togethers where I get to know my
Mm.
cousins better. And the more I know my cousins, the more I like them and
Yeah.
stuff. The cousin I was closest to is the cousin I'm closest to in age, my cousin
Hmm.
Connie. She's only a year older than me and stuff. And she among my cousins and stuff, she's the one I'm closest to. But my other
Hmm.
cousins and stuff, I really like and stuff. It's
Hmm.
just I want to get to know them now while we're still at a certain age, because as I know as we get older and stuff,
Hmm.
we just won't have time and stuff. Like
Yeah.
I like my uncles and aunts, but now they're in their 70s and 80s and stuff. I know there's a limited amount of time I have to get to know them and stuff.
Mm.
Because if I don't and stuff, they're not going to be around. A lot of my older friends and family members who I feel close to and I love have passed away. Not a lot, but
Yeah.
some of my closest friends and some of my mom passed away. My friend the Liebermans passed away. My
Hmm.
wife's best friend passed away and stuff. My father-in-law passed away, and so I'm realizing there's a limited amount of time to get to know people just because or to maintain really. And I've lost some friends due to political polarization. I've lost some friends due to um, you know, religious differences and stuff, or or this or that. And I've lost some friends, not so much lost friends. It's just they have their lives now. They have their careers. They have different friendship circles and stuff. And uh, one friend who's a teacher now, she has a lot of close friends who are teachers and stuff. And when we meet, we still have a wonderful time and stuff. But we meet what, once a year, twice a year and stuff. Whereas it used to be, I used to see an old friend pretty much every day because of school or because of this. So, I have to work at community now, whereas before I didn't have to work at it and
Yeah.
stuff. So what are the things
Mm.
that I rely on now? I'm in a church now, and I love the church. It's this Presbyterian church, but most of the people were lifelong Presbyterians. Um, I've been in that church for 10 years, and I barely know the Presbyterian denomination. I go
Mm.
because a lot of times I stay in a church, right? I stayed because I like the people and stuff. And my closest religious ties are, I still refer back to Catholic, the progressive side of Catholic theology and stuff. So I'm kind of lazy. On all this in the 10 years, I could have learned more about the Presbyterian Church. I just haven't.
Yeah.
I still don't, what does a presbytery mean? I don't know. But, so,
Yeah.
but, with you, I connected with you because I made a conscious effort to try to connect with Filipino American activists
Hmm.
so I can learn more about the issues facing the Philippines and
Hmm.
the Filipino American community and stuff.
Yeah.
But I had to make that effort to get to know people better and stuff. But in terms of friendships and stuff,
Hmm.
you most of you guys are 10, 15 years younger than me. I
Hmm.
I being around you guys makes me feel old.
Yeah, I'm 53, turning 53 this summer.
Yeah,
Um,
and you guys have your own lives and stuff. So in terms of close friendships,
yeah.
um, you know, I think because other things are drawing me and stuff, um, um, you know, I think friendships and community require time and stuff.
Yeah.
Whatever you have the most time with, that's what you become closest to. And,
Mhm.
the people who have time for you, you become close to them because they have the time for you and stuff. It's uh, um,
So,
it, does that make sense and stuff? So my
yeah,
sense of
so more
community,
effort. Hmm.
it's just more effort and stuff. And who in life are in similar life circumstances as you. So
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
people who are my age, whenever we get together and stuff, the only thing we ever talk about is, oh, so what's happening with your parents? Oh,
Hmm.
my parent has dementia, so I'm taking him to a nursing home, or my parent
Hmm.
now has, this health problem, so I'm taking him to more doctors. 90% of our conversations are how we're helping our parents.
Right, right.
If
Yeah.
I was in my 30s and stuff, most of my friends would talk about, oh, my kid is 3 years old and we
Hmm.
this is the, you know what I mean? Life experiences shape community, in my opinion and stuff. So, whereas
So it seems
before,
like it
yeah, go
seems like
ahead.
you're strategizing. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know if it's strategize. It's just life pushes you in a certain direction and stuff.
Hmm.
So, I think the reason I go to the Presbyterian church is I like the people, but also my politics closely aligns with the politics of that church, a fairly left-wing
Hmm.
activist church and stuff.
I
And
see.
that's what I'm attracted to and stuff.
Mm.
So, whereas the Asian American church, it was more diverse and stuff. Some were Democrats, some were Republicans and stuff. In the 90s, I don't know if that's the same now in an Asian American evangelical church and stuff. I'm
Hmm.
guessing that I don't know how Trump is. I know how Trump has affected white evangelical churches, but I don't know how um, Trump has affected evangelical churches of color. Because I know
Hmm.
black evangelicals overwhelmingly supported Kamala Harris in 2024. So the
Hmm.
Black evangelical church is very different than the white evangelical church. And I don't know if Latino evangelicals or Asian American evangelicals or have a similar dynamic and stuff. So, but but the Presbyterian Church, I don't have that problem. I'm not gonna. One thing I like about the Presbyterian, I'm not going to get into conflicts with conservative Christians that I got into in the 2000s and stuff. So I want to avoid that as much as possible. I don't want to get into that kind of emotional pain anymore and stuff. So um, I don't know if it's tragedy. It's just life pushed me in
Yeah.
that direction and stuff.
Yeah, it's I tend to think in terms of strategy and tactic, just because I'm a sociologist and I'm looking at culture as kind of a space of change
Yeah,
or paralleling the culture is paralleling with the material changes that are happening, which are
yeah.
causing waves and social forces that affect us, like gentrification is one of those forces that's
Um,
material driven, but it's also the culture that reinforces it. And I think that's why I asked you the question around alternative facts and like how
oh
the
yeah, okay.
manipulation of the culture and changing the board game, changing the game so
Yeah,
that it leans towards a more capitalistic view of the world. Then therefore, capitalists are the ones that have the right answers and they're the ones that have the plan. And that's why Trump is a good businessman and he makes deals. And so I think that
yeah.
culture is kind of the terrain in which that a cartoonist is sort of if responding to these forces of change.
Yeah. For misinformation, one of the things that affects it, it affects relationships in the sense it becomes more difficult to have friendships from across the ideological divide.
Hmm.
So, in the 1990s and before, I may disagree with, like, I think the reason that with my more left-wing friends, I'm able to keep those friendships,
Hmm.
a lot more of those friendships, even if we disagree, we agree on the same facts and stuff. I think what happened in the 1990s, I was able to have conservative friends because um, we may disagree more starkly, but we agreed on the same facts. We just disagreed on the solutions.
Hmm.
And starting in the 2000s, there was more of a sense of, okay, conservatives who don't believe that climate change exists, um, conservatives who don't think that racism is systemic,
Hmm.
or that economic inequalities are systemic and stuff. And so if you don't agree with that and stuff, how can you agree on any solutions if you don't agree with the facts and stuff?
Yeah.
And so that and so it becomes harder to have a reasonable dialogue when you don't agree with the facts, and it makes friendships more fraught.
Hmm.
And I don't know if that comes close to what you're saying, but I think on a personal level, it makes that sort of friendships different among different ideological spectrums more difficult because of that and stuff. Um, you know, um,
Hmm. That makes sense.
yeah. So in a community that for democracies it becomes more difficult just because democracies assume that no one group or person has a monopoly on truth, and that you need to have a debate of ideas, and
Hmm.
then when the debate reaches an impasse, you're able to compromise and find areas of common ground. When you don't have the same shared sense of facts, you don't have common ground
Hmm.
because without us, this is happening in the Philippines and stuff, and um, in the Philippines, was the martial law period a golden age? No. Was was the Philippines prospering during the Marcos dictatorship? No.
Hmm.
It actually, crony capitalism destroyed, really destroyed the Philippines. What's the Philippine economy? 60%, 70% poverty rate and stuff.
Hmm.
That's terrible and stuff. In the 80s, the only country that was worse had a worse economy in Asia. The only Asian country that had a worse economy than the Philippines was, I think, Cambodia. And the Cambodia had just gone through the killing fields and
Hmm.
stuff, So, um, you know, yeah, it's I don't know. So, without a shared sense of facts, democracy can't function. Maria Ressa, the Philippine journalist, was saying that and stuff,
Hmm.
and I agree with her and stuff. You can't have a democracy. You can't debate. A democracy requires debate, and
Hmm.
it's impossible to debate if you don't share the same sense of facts and stuff. And in a community, um, if you don't share, if you don't have a same sense, if you fall for propaganda instead of facts and stuff,
Hmm.
um, you become very vulnerable to groupthink and to autocracy and stuff. It's easy to manipulate you if you don't have the same, if you don't, if you can't get facts, if misinformation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's why, alternative facts was an important sort of historical moment of cultural strategy from the right is to demand that their version of reality was the only one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Which is like gaslighting the nation in a sense, right?
yeah. It's still happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's still happening, and it's happened in the Philippines. It's happening here. I'm guessing any
Mhm.
autocratic country it happens and stuff
Well,
because yeah, just because autocratic countries tend to be incompetent, and
mhm,
in order to hide their mistakes and their flaws and stuff,
mhm,
they have to do misinformation because if people knew the facts and stuff, those governments would be overthrown.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I saw your point about some of the same playbook being played out in the United States where there's kind of the attempt to create a kind of golden era with, beautiful buildings and beautiful bills and beautiful this and golden that and, names emblazoned on, museums and
yeah,
just all these sort of inappropriate things that are happening in an attempt to create a sense that this is a good era for everyone in the nation.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
That's why I think like um, the Japanese American community is very much supporting immigrant groups now because of what they went
Mhm.
through with their incarceration during World War II.
Mhm.
Because there's that collective memory of discrimination against that group. And they see what's happening, what happened to the Muslim American community, what's happening to those communities that are being targeted by ICE, the detention centers.
Mhm.
That's very, the Japanese American community has a collective memory of what happened during those camps during World War
Mhm.
II and stuff. And so as a group, they're very much an activist against ICE because
Mhm.
of that. Filipino Americans, if we don't remember what happened in Watsonville, what happened in the 20s and 30s, um, and stuff, we need to that's why history is important and stuff so
Mhm.
that when what happened to Filipino Americans in the 20s and 30s, what happened to Japanese Americans in the 40s, when we see that happening to Latino group communities today, we need to be in solidarity with them because the injustices that befell us are befalling another group, and we need to protect them
Mhm. Right.
and stuff.
Right.
So,
So, um, so we covered a lot of ground, and I was wondering if there's any questions that you had for me about this interview or the process or the larger project before we end the interview, or if there's
no,
anything you want to say in addition before we end.
no, just thank you. Thank you for asking and stuff. I'm a pretty opinionated person, so I don't
Yeah, thank
I
God.
really don't mind. I don't mind expressing my opinion, but also with the caveat that if you disagree with me, that's okay. I don't mind
Yeah.
if you disagree. Um, it's the only thing is if you disagree, as long as you back it up with facts and stuff.
Hmm.
Like you said, I could be wrong and stuff. It's just I'm basing this since you're asking me about my experiences. These are my experiences and stuff
Yeah.
and stuff. But
No, it helps.
yeah, so like I thank anybody who listens to it. I thank you for being willing to listen to me That's all. And I thank you for your efforts to gather experiences of people so that, hopefully your students will get something out of what I say and stuff. And if your students disagree with me, that's okay. I'm right some of the times, but I'm wrong some of the time. So you feel free to disagree with me. I could be
Yeah.
wrong.
No, no, that's my attitude too. So I appreciate that perspective, and I think students will benefit. I mean, the and my hope is that they'll explore your work. Your award-winning cartoonist. I want them to see that as as activism, as journalism, but also just art too. Art and artivism.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
and there's a lot of historical items that you mentioned that I think that could be good topics for research. So. My
Yeah.
hope is that they'll look at this and they'll say, "Oh, I really want to follow up on what happened in the Watsonville. That's where my family's from," or, what's happening in the Philippines and the parallels between, different sort of fascism that we're seeing around the world. We can compare and contrast their
Yeah.
economic systems and their histories, et cetera. But
Yeah.
yeah, this has been really enlightening, and it's good to hear from somebody who has a relationship with Catholicism too, because I do have a kind of place in my heart for Catholicism, even though I didn't stay there. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's still kind of like you said, a default, right? So when I'm in a church, I kind of look for when did we genuflect, like. So it's nice to hear that there's that kind of nuanced relationship to religion that's not just like you either like religion or you don't. It's like I don't think life is
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah, I
And,
sort of
and
have a mixed feeling towards Catholicism, but the
yeah.
progressive side has had a very positive effect on my life. I'm not a fan of the conservative side, but I
Mm.
see the Catholic Church as being nuanced.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I do too. And there's so many different people that are different in the church, in terms of their political positions and their
yeah,
cultural ways. So, we have to be, I think, in a way, more nuanced in how we see individuals and groups nowadays,
yeah,
within this alternative facts kind of culture where we're being misled and directed in ways that are not going to be in our interest. So understanding people is really important, and generational connections between people is important too, and
yeah.
history, right? And how we experience history. So again, thank you again, Angelo Lopez.
Oh, sure. Thank
Uh,
you. And I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad I'm honored, I guess, that you asked and stuff. I'm
Oh
not going
no,
to be
I
the
mean,
last.
I'm lucky. I'm lucky to have this time with you. It's like, we've had like almost 3 hours total. So appreciate your time. And I know you're busy with caregiving, and a lot of my interviews are busy with caregiving for children or,
Yeah.
other adults. So yeah, thank you so much, and hope
Okay.
you have a good rest of your weekend.
Okay. Sure. You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.